Hello.
Hi.
Hi, it's so
Oh,
good to talk to you.
good to talk to you, Leanna. Thank you for having me.
Well, it is such a pleasure. As I had mentioned to you ahead of time, I've been a fan of yours for a while, so this is very exciting to get to talk with you. And you've done a number of so many wonderful books, and we're more especially going to be talking about your newest one, which is Across So Many Seas, although we could have had a much longer conversation and talked about all your other books. But why don't we start off and you could tell us what your journey was to becoming an author?
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for those kind words. I really appreciate that so much. Well, it's always a question of where do you start? But, but I think I really do start with the car accident that led me to be in bed for a year that I write about in Lucky Broken Girl, that inspired Lucky Broken Girl. I was a girl that had to be in bed for an entire year, healing, unable to walk. That was really difficult. But the positive was that my public school sent a teacher to the house, which was amazing. We were Cuban immigrants, recently arrived, and the fact that they would care so much seemed unbelievable to us. And this teacher came over and she would bring books and teach me lessons at my bedside. And I think that was when I really became enamored of books, and saw how through reading you could escape to another world and be another person, even travel, all over in your imagination. So I think that was really pivotal for me. It was one of those turning points. And I think we all have turning points in our childhood that really set us on our path. So I became a reader. And then after I got out of the cast, I started keeping a diary, and I had a diary that locked with a little key. And I kept my, most innermost thoughts, in that diary. And I think that was one of the ways in which I started writing. And then by the time I got to high school, I had a great teacher who was also Cuban, and I was writing poetry at that time and writing in English. And she encouraged me to write in Spanish. She said, "Well, you have both languages. You can write in Spanish too." And I started trying to write poems in Spanish as well. So those were major inspirations. And then I just always wanted to write and just found my way to many different genres. It was poetry, nonfiction, fiction, playwriting. I even tried my hand at that, memoir. I'm just interested in every way that one can possibly express oneself through writing. So yeah, so that's the journey I've been on since I was about 10.
Oh, that's amazing. And of course, you're also an anthropologist. And I love how you always weave these elements of culture and history, identity into your stories. Do you find that fiction allows you to kind of explore those issues in a different way than, say, you do in your academic work?
Very much. Yeah, I'm really glad to be able to be writing fiction, though I also love the academic work that I've done and that I continue to do. I think they're both an important part of my life. I love scholarship, I love research, I love being in the archives, I love reading
Mm.
books, I love interviewing people and listening to people's stories. All of that led me to want to be an anthropologist. So yeah, so I think, anthropology allowed me to travel, to meet people in Spain, Mexico, and Cuba, to speak Spanish, which was something I very much wanted to do in different places and get to really learn about all the different cultures that have some sort of Spanish ancestry. I found that so fascinating. But what fiction allows me to do is not just to explain or interpret or to analyze, which are all very important things, but in fiction, you don't do that. I mean, you can, your characters can do that, but you're kind of living life through your characters. And what I love about fiction is that you can go into the heart and the feelings and the emotions of your characters. And while you could potentially do that in anthropology, and in some ways I've written a lot about being a vulnerable observer. So, I think it can be done in anthropology, but it's not the same. I feel like in fiction, you can really go deep, really be in the shoes of your characters and just see, how did it feel to be a 12-year-old in 1492?
Right.
How did it feel to be 12 the Cuban Revolution, and just really go through all the emotions and the feelings, of your various characters. So I love that, and I love that in fiction I can invent dialogue. I
Mm.
can't do that as an anthropologist. I have to use the dialogue that, that actually happened, or I have to, take interviews that actually happened and use those for my writing. But in fiction, I can make up an interview, I can make up dialogue. So it allows me to, to really use my imagination in a very bold way and kind of try to imagine what happened, but also imagine what could have happened.
Mm.
And those are all things that fiction gives you this, vast freedom to do so much with storytelling.
Which allows you to, I mean, I know as you mentioned, across so many seas, for those that don't know, I mean, it gives four different girls voice, because I know you've said that when you look in the archives, these are people that don't usually show up. Young girls,
Right.
we don't usually have much trace of them. And so you're able to kind of explore what it, like you said, what it would have been like to have been 12 in 1492. And so, as we said, it explores the story of four young Jewish girls across several centuries and continents. Can tell us, what was the inspiration behind this book? It's such a unique story.
Thank you. Well, it's funny. From the very beginning, I had the idea of four girls. So from the very beginning, I knew there would be four girls in the story. I knew more or less the time period. So I had somehow the structure just came into my mind, and I wrote it out as basically a two-page outline, and that was the beginning of the novel. But there were two inspirations, and it might seem really odd the way it worked out. But so one inspiration is 1492. I've always been really curious about what that experience would have been like. We all associate 1492 with Columbus and, the conquest of the Americas, so we think of 1492 that way. We might also realize that that was the year that the Spanish kings conquered Granada. So the Granada, which was the last Muslim kingdom in Spain, was conquered at the beginning of 1492, and then at the end of 1492, that's when Columbus sails off to the Americas. But in the middle of all that, at the end of March, that's when they basically promulgate. I don't know if that's the right word, but issue this edict of expulsion of the Jewish communities in Spain. Are you okay, Leanna?
No, sorry. It just hit me. It
Um,
was fine before. Please.
so yeah, so that's when the edict of expulsion is basically distributed around Spain, and so it's just such an amazing moment to think about. This is how Sephardic Jews trace their ancestry to that moment when they were expelled from Spain, when this edict of expulsion was issued, and it was basically a choice of, you can stay here in your homeland where you've lived for 1,000 years, but you'll have to convert to Christianity, to Catholicism in particular. You'll have to convert if you want to stay. And then if you don't want to convert, then you will just have to leave the country, leave the kingdom. So that's where Sephardic Jews trace their ancestry from. And Sephardic comes from Sepharad, which means Spain in Hebrew. So it's this community of Jewish people that trace their ancestry to Spain. They think of themselves as original Spaniards, in a sense, and kind of they're like early exiles, or you can think of them as I think of them in a way as early Latino immigrants, because they left Spain, but they held on to Spanish. And so they continued to speak a language that eventually came to be called Ladino. And it's the language that Sephardic Jews speak, as opposed to, say, Yiddish, which is spoken by Eastern European Jews. And a lot of Eastern European Jews, when they first encountered Sephardic Jews, they didn't understand how it was possible that they didn't speak Yiddish, because they assumed that every Jewish person must speak Yiddish, because it is a Jewish language. But so is Spanish, so is Ladino
Mm.
for Sephardic Jews. So I was really just fascinated by 1492. That was a big inspiration for me. And so I created the character of Benvenida, who's a 12-year-old girl living in Spain in 1492 in the city of Toledo, which was a city where the three religions coexisted: Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And so it was a site of all of this interaction between the three communities. So that's where she's living, and that's the home that she has to leave behind. So that idea came to me as I thought about 1492. That was one inspiration. And the other inspiration was my grandmother, my paternal grandmother, who was named Rebecca, but I call her Reina, or Queen, in the book. And her story was so interesting and so mysterious. she took a boat from Turkey to Cuba in the 1920s, sent off by her parents. We don't know exactly why, but off she went, solita, to Cuba. And we know that she brought an oud, which is a Middle Eastern instrument similar to a medieval lute. And she brought this oud with her, and she sang these old Spanish songs, these old Sephardic songs, though she was a Turkish person, but she spoke the old Spanish of the 15th century. And so that's basically that all we knew about her. And I thought, this is so mysterious, and she never gave us that many details about her life. But I was just so taken by, the fact that she sang old songs, these old Spanish love songs, that she had an oud, that she traveled by herself. I mean, all of that was just so compelling to me. So I thought, okay, she's going to be an inspiration, but I want to know, rather than just try to write her story, I thought I would write about one of her ancestors. And so Benvenida came to me in 1492. And then I thought, okay, we'll just jump from 1492 to Reina's story and then try to see who Reina's descendants are. And so then I came up with the other two characters, with Allegra and Paloma, so that we see who Reina's daughter and granddaughter are. So it's sort of, the history goes both back and forward at the same time. And so that's how it came to me. And I just wrote one story after the other. And the big challenge was to figure out how they would connect, how these four stories would connect, because you could read them individually and then go, well, but what does this have to do with the other story, before or after? So it was fun because you have to read the whole book to the very last page to see
Yeah.
how they connect with each other. So it was fun for me to write because I also wasn't quite sure how it would all end. So I was trying to figure out, how is this story going to end? And hopefully the reader finds it interesting that way too, because maybe they're wondering, but they still want to keep reading to see
Right.
what the connection is going to be.
Yeah, so I won't spoil anything. We won't say what it is, but it is. But one of the things that goes through it is common thread is the arts, whether poetry or music. And I love the fact that the oud, that's really comes from your family's story. I was wondering about that. What was it? What do you think it was about having that kind of creative outlet that helped them with all the challenges that they faced? I mean, we mentioned the expulsion from Spain, but each of them, faced a lot of challenges in their lives, and whether it's the music or the poetry. And you have one song in particular that kind of runs through the book. Why do you think that was so important to them?
Well, various things. So I read a chronicle from 1492 written by a priest who was watching this community leave Spain. And he writes about how they were offered baptism. They could have stayed, but they were leaving and they would not turn back. And then he noticed that they were being encouraged by the rabbis, particularly the women and the children were being encouraged to sing
Mm.
and play the tambourine as they left Spain. And that was just so incredible to me. That's the epigraph to the book. And I thought, how interesting. They're leaving a country that they love. They really don't want to leave, but they also don't want to give up their faith. And they're singing. And they're singing as they're leaving. I just thought that was so amazing. So I thought, well, so song is going to be an important part of the story. And the first girl in 1492, Benvenida, writes poetry. She writes poems, which is kind of amazing because that's an era when most girls, cannot even read and write. And she's not just reading and writing, she's writing poems. I thought, she's going to be this girl with like this huge need to express herself. And so then that kind of became the inspiration for the others as well. They all have this huge need to express themselves, and poetry, of course, is one of the ways you can really express what your soul is aching to say. And so I thought they'll all have some sort of connection to poetry and to song and to music. And to this day, the songs, those Sephardic songs, and particularly the one that comes up over and over in the book about the girl in the tower in the middle of the sea, there's certain songs that you just hear a lot. They resonate and they connect you to that early history from the 15th century.
Mm.
So song isn't just something to entertain you. It's actually your connection to your heritage. So these songs are in Ladino, they're in the old Spanish, where you say ija instead of hija,
Mm,
for example. So there's a different pronunciation. It's, a different take on the Spanish because it's in old Spanish, but it's also a Spanish encrusted with all these other languages that they have picked up
mm,
in the course of their different diasporas. So I wanted to just show that, to try to think about these girls, each of whom are living in a revolutionary moment, a moment of great,
right.
historical transformation. And, what is it that keeps them anchored in a sense to their own humanity and to reality? And that's poetry and song and music that connects them back, but also gives them a future where their heritage will still continue as well.
Yeah, and especially that song in particular, it has such longing and kind of melancholy in it, and that's something that I wondered. There's this question, and a lot of children's literature now. There's a lot of talk about not just showing painful moments in maybe a culture's
Right.
history, but also showing the joy. And I wondered about that when you read this book. I mean, that you are understanding so much of the painful history as that they went through. How do you balance that with also showing some elements of joy, or is that a false dichotomy to that it has to be kind of one or the other?
No, I don't think it's a false dichotomy at all. I mean, I think this is a really important question. I think about it all the time because I write books that have to do with characters who are struggling in different kinds of ways, whether it's Ruthie and Lucky Broken Girl struggling with, will I ever walk again? Will I ever get out of bed?
Mm-hmm.
Will I be a normal kid one day? Or in Letters from Cuba, you have, a girl immigrating from Poland to Cuba, and she's got to save her family in Poland. If things are getting worse and worse, how will she get them to Cuba? And now, and across so many seas, we've got four girls, struggling with their identity, and can they hold on to their identity through, all kinds of calamities that are happening. So I'm really aware that my books are about complex and often sad topics, and I certainly don't want to depress children who are reading my books. It's definitely not what I want to do. But yet, I think that children need to know about deep issues like the ones I write about. So I do try to create a balance. I do try to create a balance between the sadness and the sorrow and the pain, but also the hope and the resilience that these characters have. They go through a lot, but they find hope. Benvenida finds hope when she gets to reconnect with her family, who are in Naples. So she goes with her family to Naples, and then from Naples they go on to Istanbul, to what is now Istanbul, to Turkey. And throughout this whole process, there's tremendous loss and sorrow, and she keeps wondering, should we have stayed in Spain? Should we just have converted and stayed in Spain? And then kind of realizing that no, we made the right decision. It's been difficult. We've lost so much, but there's hope, and we've stayed true to our beliefs and to our faith and to our heritage. So I think with each of the characters, you see them grappling with that, but then kind of ultimately seeing that there is hope and that the struggle was terrible, but it was worth it. That Ruthie goes through such a terrible experience of being in the body cast, but then when she's out of the cast, she realizes that she's, that she is lucky, that she was broken, but she's also lucky because she's learned so much during that terrible year. That's the year that she had a metamorphosis. She even uses that word, and I have her use that word in the book. And so I think each of these characters is going through a metamorphosis, and they've all been broken in various ways, and across so many seas. But then they find a way to think about the aspects that have been lucky, that maybe they've gained more resilience, they've gained more strength, more courage. They've seen their families, survive very difficult situations, and that gives them the strength to survive difficult situations in the future. So I think that's how I see it, that it's hope that I'm trying to balance with struggle and with sorrow. Yeah.
And something else that you had mentioned was of this idea of exploring identity. Um,
Mhm.
and I know you recently did an interview on multicultural kid blogs, and you mentioned how it can be very frustrating when people try to fit you into a very narrow box. And instead of seeing how complex identities can you talk more about that and just how you explore intersectional identities in your books?
Yeah, well, It's true. I mean, heritage and identity are very big themes in my work, and part of that comes from the anthropology background. Part of it comes from my own unusual background of being Cuban and Jewish and Sephardic and Latina, and I mean, all this whole mix of identities. And so I think from a very young age, I've been very aware that most of us, I think all of us probably, I don't dare to generalize, since in anthropology we're taught not to generalize, but to be aware of the diversity of people. But I think we can say that almost all of us, or most of us, have complex identities. We're never just one thing. You know, we might be, in terms of gender, we might be one thing; in terms of nationality, another; in terms of ethnicity, another; in terms of religion, another. So I can be Latina, but you know, I'm also Jewish. And people tend to think of Latinos in a certain way. They'll have certain stereotypes of Latinos and where they should come from and what religion they should be. And then they find out, well, no, you can be a Latina where Spanish is your first language, as it is with me, but I also have Jewish ancestry. And in fact, I always say this statement when I'm asked about this. I'll say I am Jewish because I am Cuban, because you know I would not be alive today if my four grandparents had not found refuge in Cuba on the eve of World War II. So if I'm Jewish, it's because I'm Cuban. It's because Cuba gave my ancestors refuge and they were able to rebuild their lives and find a new home in Cuba, and you know, and have their children who were my parents, and which is one of the reasons why I feel such a very close tie to Cuba. I really think of it as just such an important part of my identity and feel very connected to the language and the culture and the people and the history. And I teach a course every year about Cuba, and really, to me, that's home. That's the home that will always be the home of my heart. And so I think people might not expect that. I think people might think, you know, a Cuban is a certain kind of person, or a Jewish person is a certain kind of person. And with me, I had, you know, the intersectionality of not just being Cuban and Jewish, but being Jewish in two different ways, you know. And I think people also don't always realize that if you're a Jew of Sephardic ancestry, it's very different than being a Jew of Ashkenazi ancestry, because the cultures are so different. But I happen to have grown up with both because my parents were this quote unquote intermarriage between Ashkenazi and Sephardic, where my mother's parents, they were the ones who said, well, how is it possible that, you know, that Albertico and my father Albert, I mean, how Alberto, how was it that his family didn't speak Yiddish? How could they call themselves Jewish and not speak Yiddish? It seemed so outlandish to them. And then on my father's side, Spanish was a Jewish language for them because that was the language that they had spoken since, you know, 1492. And so I had Jewish intersectionality early on, and then I had this Latino and Jewish intersectionality, as well. And I really sort of came to understand it as a child when I was growing up, and I would, you know, see the different kinds of foods that we ate for the different holidays and different celebrations. So that, you know, I definitely ate matzo ball soup, you know, at my maternal grandparents' house, but then at my paternal grandparents' house, we would have stuffed grape leaves, dolmas, and borrecas and bulemas, and I mean all of these, you know, foods that come from Turkey and the Middle East. And that seemed totally normal to me. The other thing that seemed totally normal was, at the end of Passover, where we had eaten matzah for an entire week and not had bread. Then at the end of that celebration, we would go to a Cuban restaurant to celebrate. You know, it's like, okay, we're done with matzah. We'd go to a Cuban restaurant. And often we would also go, growing up in New York, we would go to a Cuban Chinese restaurant
Huh.
as well, that I remember very fondly because there was a large Chinese community as well in Cuba. And that was one of my, I think maybe one of my first moments that I became aware of intersectionality, without, of course, having the concept yet. But I thought, well, if Chinese Cubans exist, then Jewish Cubans must be able to exist as well. And so I think all of those intersections just were very interesting to me from a very early age, and I think made me aware of how complex identities are, and that we're not just one thing, that we're often trying to, you know, connect different identities together in ourselves. So it's a very personal thing for me, but I've also come to really look for it also in the way that I write about my characters in my books.
Beautiful. And I love that, like you mentioned about other intersectionalities, that when you do bring it in, often there's a celebration of other cultures happening, like whether you're talking about Tia Fortuna's new home, and she goes to her home at the end, and there are all these other cultures and her
Yes.
new home that celebrate, or across so many seas that, sorry, I'm blanking on the last, it was at Allegra, that her father was Afro-Cuban.
Oh, Paloma.
So Paloma, I'm
Yeah.
sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, Paloma. That, so she had adding another layer of cultures into her heritage.
Exactly.
And I know that's something that you talk about, is it's possible to preserve one's own history and culture while still celebrating other people's. And I think sometimes people have this idea that if you are very proud of where you come from, that somehow that leads to denigrating other cultures. I know
Mm.
you have a very different view about that.
Absolutely. I definitely think we have to live with mutual understanding of one another's cultures and heritage and identity. And I think that's what led me really to study anthropology, was really my fascination with the diversity of cultures and languages. And, just like I remember as a young person, just like how amazing that people speak all these different languages. There's all these different ways to speak about the world. And I just found that so incredible. And I think that's one of the things that we all have to fight for, not just anthropologists, but, to really respect, that diversity. That's one of the beautiful things about our humanity, is that, we have found so many ways to express ourselves, and to be in the world. And that's so amazing. And we're living in an age where we're more interconnected than ever before, as we are now with the internet and so on. I mean, it's amazing that you can be on a WhatsApp call with, somebody in Cuba, and, reconnect, even from a distance. It's so amazing. So I think, we live in an age where we need to respect, the fact that heritage has been passed on to us in different ways, and that's so amazing. But at the same time, that we share so much, and now with climate issues and so on, there's so much that we have to do to work together, as much as possible. That's really so important. And in my books, I just hope that young people come away with a sense of the importance of compassion, the importance of empathy, the importance of coexistence, as well. I try to create characters that are all kind of different from each other. In Letters from Cuba, Esther, who's a Polish Jewish girl arriving in Cuba, in a small town in Cuba, becomes friends with an Afro-Cuban girl, with a Chinese-Cuban boy, and she's aware that they each have a unique culture, but they share things as well. And I think finding a way to balance that connection between how we're all unique, but at the same time we share so much. And I think one way maybe to convey that to kids is to just think again about food. And we think of, like, you think about something like a pizza, with its tomato sauce. We think of that as like an Italian, an Italian food, but tomatoes originally come from Peru, for example. So somehow, the tomatoes traveled from Peru to Italy, in some way, and became part of Italian cuisine, or the potato the same way is from Peru, or chocolate coming originally from Mexico, but we think of Belgian chocolates, so there's all these ways in which, culture has moved around, traveled around, and we share so much. And so just via food, we can see like just how much we share. But in addition to sharing, we also have to respect the uniqueness of each culture and each language, and do what we can to preserve as much of that as possible, because that's really what makes us human, that we have so many unique ways to approach the world, and they all have legitimacy, and they all need to be respected, by all of us to create a better world.
Thank you so much for taking the
Thank
time to
you.
talk with us today.